You always stand up and tell people what you succeeded, what you believe in. Again, through this research, I know that some of you have had significant failures in life. And we all know that you probably learn more from what doesn't go right than what does. Could I ask several of you to identify something in your career or your personal life that didn't work out, that didn't reach the standard that you might have had, and how that informed you and how that will make you a better president in 2013?
I'll be glad to start this then. I was born, a little bit like Dr. Paul, I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And when I was about 2, my mother divorced and remarried a couple years later. And I was born in McPherson. I was adopted and became a Gingrich, my stepfather's name. And in that period, my mother was working, and I had a grandmother who really raised me and spent a lot of the time raising me. And she was a very old-fashioned, very deeply religious person. And so between the time I was 2 and about 5, she worked very hard to make sure I understood that there was heaven and hell, and that one was preferable and the other wasn't. And she was fairly vivid in explaining the concept. And I went through a relatively complex life because my dad was a career soldier. So I grew up originally in Pennsylvania in the Lutheran church and sang in the boys' choir and did the things you do in a small town. Then became, for example, a Presbyterian acolyte at one point, because you basically became whatever the Protestant chaplain was as you moved around the world. And I would have said that I was a pretty religious person. It had been driven very deeply by my grandmother. And after I got married and things became more complicated, we had 2 wonderful daughters. Although I was remarkably successful in many ways, I was a PhD, I was a congressman, had a lot of very exciting things going on. There was a part of me that was truly hollow. And it was almost like the harder I worked and the more things I did, the hollower I got inside. And finally, a friend of mine who was a banker in Griffin, Georgia, actually gave me the 2 books that are the base of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I wasn't drinking, but I had precisely the symptoms of somebody who was collapsing under this weight. And I found myself, as an emerging national figure, reading the big book and trying to understand where I had failed and why I was empty and why I had to turn to God. And I think that had I not had that experience and I had not had that intervention, I might literally have collapsed totally. And that was really the beginning of turning my life around and beginning to help me understand. And it's, I've been very, very fortunate and very blessed. Calista and I have a wonderful marriage. We're very close to our 2 daughters, Kathy and Jackie, and their husbands. And as many of you know, I'm extremely close to Maggie and Robert, who are my 2 grandchildren. But all of that has required a great deal of pain, some of which I have caused, others which I regret deeply. All of it has required having to go to God to seek both reconciliation, but also to seek God's acceptance, that I had to recognize how limited I was and how much I had to depend on Him. And I was asked at one of the events we did whether I'd be comfortable with somebody who was an atheist as president. And I answered from the heart, which is I said no. And the reason is simple. I think if it's, we once had a friend who was a recovering alcoholic who was approached by a federal official who said, if you all could drop the 2nd step, we could fund the other 11 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the 2nd step's the one that says you recognize there's a higher being. And he said to me, I think you misunderstand why it works. And if you said to me, we were electing somebody who believed that they by themselves were strong enough to be President of the United States, I would tell you that person terrifies me, because they completely misunderstand how weak and how limited any human being is.